There we go.
Perfect. Good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Thornton, and I am a professor in the School of Business and part of the work group on accessible teaching. I will be presenting Introduction to Digital Accessibility this morning with Casey Raymond. Casey, say hi, introduce yourself.
So I'm Casey Raymond. I'm in chemistry. I'm also part of the work group, and I'm leading this year's cohort of accessibility fellows. And so really the goal today is to, share some tips and some introduction on digital accessibility, just to give folks a taste of some things they can do to improve everyone's life.
Great. We can go ahead and get started on the slides though. It always makes sense to me before we jump right into digital accessibility and the principles around that and some tactics to just sort of level set and make sure that we start with talking about what is accessibility in general. And so we will begin our introduction there, and then between Casey and I, we will share with you sort of 5 focus areas that we think about around digital accessibility specifically. So to me, when I think about this, I think as professors, we are pretty much all familiar with the concept of accommodations, right? This is when we have a student that has perhaps a particular diagnosis or the ability to get extra time on tests or a distraction-free environment so that they can succeed based on the particular individual challenges that they have. And that's a very reactive or responsive approach. Accessibility kind of turns that concept on its head and comes at it from a much more proactive space, where we are designing with that equity in mind from the beginning. And so whether it is our in-person courses, our online classes, or something like you see depicted here in the cartoon, it's all about kind of social justice and making sure that we are thinking from an inclusive place from the beginning. So outlined here in this cartoon, which I love, we share this a lot, especially relevant with the snowy environment in Oswego. And you've got somebody here diligently shoveling the snow off the steps, a group of students, one in a wheelchair, several others not, waiting to get into the building. And what the student in the wheelchair says is, could you please start with shoveling the ramp? And the reason why that would make sense to start there is because there's nothing precluding every other student from also entering the building on a shoveled ramp, right? Then they could go ahead and clear the steps second. So instead of necessarily thinking about the perspective of, well, I'll just wait and do the ramp last because there's only one student that needs the ramp, really by starting with the ramp, everybody can kind of make their way in, and then we can finish up with the steps to just widen the overall entry. So that idea that accessibility or access is not necessarily just for the people that need it, but instead is something that could be just an overall inclusive approach is kind of the mindset that we're going for. Another sort of like similar concept, but I think that this is something that when I was an accessibility fellow and subsequently working as the coordinator, that really struck me. And that is that there are all kinds of circumstances that we can point to in our lives where technologies or innovations that were created specifically for folks that had different ability levels or, were using some sort of assistive technology, such as in this case, automatic sliding doors, could really benefit a lot of folks in different circumstances. So if you've got a shopping cart, if you're pushing kids in a baby carriage, or you're in a wheelchair, the idea of a hands-free door, or even thinking about during COVID, right? Like this is a great innovation that ultimately really benefits all of us. I like to talk a lot about captioning for this as well. And when we think about students, for example, who may not have any challenges with hearing, but are interested in maybe listening to or watching a lecture while on public transportation or in a room with lots of other students who are also doing the same thing. Captioning is something that can really benefit more than just individuals that have specifically hearing impaired circumstances. So the one thing, I, as a little bit of a stats geek, come from the public health sphere. I love kind of thinking about the numbers. And that being said, whenever I see this one, I'm always kind of taken aback. 20% or 1 in 5 Americans have a disability. I think that statistic can be a little shocking when we think about it, because oftentimes we're coming from the perspective of things that are really obvious in terms of disabilities. So a person using a cane or a seeing eye dog or in a wheelchair, that where there's a really clear physical impairment. But the reality is that most disabilities are not visible to us. Oftentimes they're cognitive or mental or neurological, or otherwise just something that is not readily apparent. And this is oftentimes the case with our students. And because of that, we put students in a position where they would be forced to sort of self-declare or self-identify what that disability may be in order to get accommodations or services. Okay, so you can go to the next slide. So thinking about sort of more the full spectrum of possible types of disabilities that we may encounter or not even know that we're encountering in our classrooms, the kind of tips and tricks that we have attempted to engage faculty on at Oswego and help to, folks to learn more about are really intended to address a variety of types of disabilities. I think that we're not going to focus right in this session or as accessibility fellows or as, kind of any of the committees that I'm working on things like, physical access to buildings like that cartoon that we saw. We're going to be thinking about the types of disabilities that our students present with that can make it challenging for them to be successful in our courses, whether in the classroom or online. So, and I think what's important to think about here is that that's not necessarily a situation that's chronic or permanent in many cases. Oftentimes, our disabilities are going to be something that's temporary or situational. This sort of infographic here, I think, sheds a good light on that you may have somebody who has a challenge using a keyboard because they were born without hands or they only have one arm. But that can also be true for a student, for example, that breaks their arm in a sports event, or a new parent who's trying to juggle a baby, or I heard somebody mention, right, that you've got a cat climbing across the keyboard, right? So there are all kinds of situations, circumstances that any one of us could find ourselves in, that this idea of designing for inclusivity really kind of can help address, even if we're not just focused on a student that has an accommodation. So with kind of that background in mind, we're going to kind of move into the space that really specifically focuses on digital accessibility. And so what I want you to be thinking about in kind of the next handful of minutes that we're talking here is the kind of documents, content, spaces that we create for our students that exist online or in a document that they're reading over email, something like that, right? That and how they would interact with that, and what are some tools or ideas that we can use, concepts, to make sure that those spaces, the digital virtual spaces that our students are interacting in, are also accessible. So there's 5 principles that we're going to focus on, and we will start with structured content. So structured content, the way that you want to think about this is really taking a document, an email, a part of a website that is going to be trying to communicate a lot of information and putting it in a manner that is visually organized and appealing, but also sort of identifies or tags certain pieces of it that make it more accessible and usable to somebody who may be using something like a screen reader, or be using keyboard tools to navigate instead of something like a mouse or a touchpad, right? So there's 2 main focus areas that we think about with that, and that's headings and lists. And I will show you an example of exactly what those are here in just a moment. All right, so if you think about this slide as having 2 parts, the left and the right, what we know here is that when we're talking about the words or the content, both of these things are communicating the exact same information, right? This is a recipe for peanut butter cookies that is Rebecca Mushtair's favorite recipe, as it were. And all of the words are the same on both the left and the right. Now, I'm a big cooker, not a big baker, but that's fine. but it's readily apparent when I look at side 2, right? What I'm looking at, it's a recipe. That's how they're always structured. It feels like it flows. The information is put in such a way that is clear, obvious to the eye, right? On the left-hand side, it's a paragraph. If I read through it, it's got all the same details and information, right? But it doesn't jump out at me as being obvious. So if I'm a student, for example, that has challenges with executive functioning or ADHD or any number of other kinds of mental processing issues that could create distractions when trying to read something. Looking at the recipe on the right is a much clearer, obvious approach that has cues about what I'm doing, what I'm talking about, right? Now, more importantly, when we think about then the students that are either using keyboard assistive technology or a screen reader to access this information, maybe that student is visually impaired or is not able to just scroll down using a trackpad, something like that. What we see here is you've got a few different areas that are highlighted and tagged as specific headings. That's going to be the top label there, then the ingredients and the directions. This allows that person to just jump from section to section there. The other thing that you see is 2 versions of lists. We've got our ingredients that are bulleted, and then the directions, which are numerical. And identifying these as being different than regular text is also very helpful in navigating digital content because it cues somebody who doesn't have that visual cue of the bullet point, right? That this is a list of things that are put together, like in this case, ingredients, or it's a list of things that have to be done in a certain order, which we see below. Yeah, Kristen said that there's no flour there. If I'm not mistaken, Rebecca is gluten-free. And so I believe that is part of what's going on here. Okay, so you get the sense, right? There's 2 things happening when we talk about structured content. It's about how it looks, and it's about the cues that are built into that content for somebody who isn't able to see it in the same way I might be able to. Okay, we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Sorry, I had a couple. It's a matter of what screen am I on to cycle.
You're moving fast. I can't even talk that fast, and I'm a fast talker. Okay. I think you are going to take us away here. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Great.
I am.
I'll hand it off to you.
So another component that we commonly use are images or variations of other content that isn't text to convey information. And it's really important that we provide some kind of an equivalent to that other content that assistive technology can make use of. And so text equivalence is one way to go about doing that. And you'll commonly hear it referred to as alt text. You want to provide the information on whatever that image is. But in some cases, you put it in just because it looks nice or just because it, creates something that's visually appealing. In that case, it's really just decorative. And you can just identify that alt text with 2 quotation marks, and assistive technology will recognize that, it's just a decorative image. It doesn't require explanation to understand the content within whatever document you're doing. But in other cases, you really do need to provide a context of what that alternative, that non-text information is. The important point is it probably should be discussed in the text in the first place. A decorative image wouldn't, so here's, an example of an image, right? And so what kind of alt text or what kind of description might you consider using for this? And in reality, it's going to depend on how and where you're using it, right? In some cases, it might be considered just decorative. In other cases, you want to be very clear that it's the State University of New York, right? And so it requires us to think critically about why we're putting an image in a document and what information that image is trying to convey. In some cases, it is just a simple description. In other cases, you really need, to communicate why that image is there and what that image is conveying to people. And I guess one other thing I'll comment here on being a chemist, if thinking about mathematical equations, a lot of the time, that's conveying really important information. And there are ways to provide alternative text that assistive technologies can make use of to communicate that information. And so if you don't actually see the equation, you can still understand it. And so this is touching on something that we'll really address later in the presentation, but everything that we're showing you can get really quite complicated, right? We don't want you to focus on that. We want you to focus on the little pieces, the simple things that we can do that make a great improvement. And just providing some kind of alternative text, alternative information on images is a small step that can be really beneficial. The third area, the third principle that we really like to address from an accessibility standpoint is color contrast. And, especially with digital technology, we can use whatever color we want. We don't have to worry about it printing it and everything else. But there's two things to really keep in mind about using color. First, you have to have enough contrast between two different colors that you're using so that people can see it and it's recognizable. You also need to be careful that you don't rely on color only to demonstrate differences. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of both of these just to help relay what we're referring to. And here's just an example of 3 different levels of color contrast. And there's ways to check, if color contrast is acceptable or not. Currently, you really want a contrast of about 4.5 to 1 or better. In some cases, you want a color contrast of 7 to 1 to really make a visual difference in the colors. Probably this dark blue text on a black background is poor for everybody at a contrast of 2 to 1. And so thinking about this contrast is important. And one little tidbit there is realizing that red, our bright red that we commonly use on white, isn't a great contrast, and it's not a great contrast to black. But we use it often. The other reason to think about color contrast, and Anne has kind of brought this up, is this: which image is more clear? The one on the left that you can actually see is red and green, or the one on the right where you have 2 teams in black and gray, and how do you tell who's playing who? And this is actually a fairly infamous football game now where the NFL decided to use these uniforms and then realized, anyone that had a red-green color issue had a great difficulty watching this game because that's what they saw as this image on the right. And this is an example of you're relying on color primarily to convey information. And you want to really be careful with that. The fourth area is contextual hyperlinks. You put the link in association with the text that it's related to. Don't just say click here. Because folks are like, where am I going? What is that? What am I clicking here for? As well as make it clear. And the other part of it is, don't just put the link in, the whole URL, the address. So here's 2 examples related. One way, and you've probably seen lots of folks do this, please register for the community potluck by going to and giving the URL, the address. sure, we can read that URL and we recognize it's for the WRVO picnic, but assistive technology is actually going to read that statement. And it can be, pretty cumbersome for somebody using assistive technology to do that. Whereas using that URL right here in terms of, let's say, register, that's the goal. This is going to take you to the registration for the WRVO Community Potluck. Now, you might end up deciding you want to highlight WRVO Community Potluck as your part that you're going to link to. That would be fine as well. It's the key point is hitting on being descriptive and including that information as part of the text. This can be done in emails, it can be done in digital documents, basically anything where you are providing that link. The last of our 5 principles is plain language. And it really means in general communications, use clear, concise statements. We've recognized, as everybody does, that in certain discipline specific communications, you'll have to use some more technical language or some specific jargon and so forth. And that might not be as clear to the general person, but in most of your communications, you want to be pretty clear and concise in your statements. It makes it much more efficient for students and others to understand what you're trying to convey. All right. And so keeping these 5 principles in mind, we want you to be realistic. You starting out thinking about keeping, accessibility in mind is important. If you've already got a whole bunch of content and it's not accessible, you're not sure, just start simple. Just start addressing the things that are public facing, probably your syllabi. But more importantly, as you start to create new documents and new content, think about these 5 principles and start employing them. And by thinking about these 5 things that we've just shown you and incorporating those into documents that you make, you actually have a huge potential impact on others using your content without needing to do anything very complicated, other than adjusting a little bit on how you create your documents. You have a big impact. Now, we haven't shown you how to do any of this, but there's plenty of resources that we want you to be aware of. The first one is our campus's digital accessibility webpage. And I'm going to show you that. There's the Faculty Accessibilities Program. There's these breakout sessions that CELT runs every winter and spring. And they all go into these additional pieces of content. And we have, here's our digital accessibility page. And particularly Kate Percival has developed a huge number of tutorials that we can take advantage of. How to deal with doing accessible content in multiple software packages for creating documents or slide decks related to meetings. There's a lot of our pre-recorded videos are already here. And so this is a great resource. And if something doesn't make sense or you think something's missing, please reach out to particularly the work group on accessibility practices, because we can do that. And who is that? Well, here's our campus accessibility groups, and there's several, but the work group on accessibility practices is a really key one to reach out to. And the members are listed there. I mentioned the Faculty Accessibility Fellows Program. That group is also listed here. And this is the list of the past and current accessibility fellows. Now, none of these folks are going to have all the answers, right, to whatever questions you might come up with. But they are also a good resource to reach out to and start with. Because even if they aren't aware of the answer as being part of the fellows program, they'll have a pretty good idea of where to send you and where to direct you to better accomplish that. And so that's really the key things that we wanted to address today is, present these 5 components, 5 principles of digital accessibility, make you aware of them, make you aware of how big an impact they can have, so that you can go and learn more and keep them in mind as you create documents.
Casey, one last plug. Immediately following this session at 9:30, I'm going to be following these same 5 principles and giving you a high-level look at how Brightspace or D2L has some resources built in that can help us to do that. So that's going to be a much more process-focused session as opposed to kind of the kind of high-level introduction that we gave you today. But stick around if you're able, and we'll be able to go through some additional examples and actually how to make that happen in Brightspace.
Well, I was planning on sticking around, but right now I'm thinking, oddly enough, my students in their evaluations complained about what I thought was neatly handwritten slides. And not that I have all the time or capability to transform what I think for physics is more appropriate to have handwritten diagrams and things pointing to different things that you could never really do digitally. I'm wondering, in the physics world, we use a program called LaTeX that generates a PDF document, and I guess I will go Google, unless one of you can answer, whether there is a way to then have the PDF document carry alt text into it. That I don't know yet.
So the simple fact of the matter is PDFs can be made accessible, but they really can be problematic. And so that's a bigger conversation, and that we can have with others. But the key thing is, generally, if you can avoid making a PDF, it will be more accessible. But we are going to have to kind of clear so that we can do the save and get the next session started. All right.
Thank you.
And are we going to all have to leave?